Where is the Ark?
The Ark is somewhere very safe.
The Ark is a source of unspeakable power and it has to be researched.
And it will be, I assure you, Dr. Brody. Dr. Jones, we have top men working on it right now.
This over here is the Intel Arc A750, and this is one of the most requested videos on my channel. After a year later, when Intel has launched this, pretty much a year later, I finally have some really good news, my friends, and I've been holding out for making this review for a purpose, but now finally I can make a review about this, and my friends, there's some good news.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out WhoKeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out WhoKeys.com in the video description below.
Firstly, I want to talk about this specific card because this is called Sparkle Intel Arc A750 Titan OC. So basically it's a bit of an OC edition, which kind of means something and kind of means nothing at the same time. But basically there's a few different Arc cards available now. So there's the Intel Founders Edition, there's some from Acer, there's some from this Sparkle. By the way, this is the 3-fan card, but there's also a 2-fan card that is a little bit cheaper, and then some other manufacturers as well. So it's nice to see different designs. But why I think this one particularly here is very different is because this is a team blue card. You can clearly see everything is team blue and black. You even get this blue GPU holder. Unfortunately, it doesn't match quite as well with the card, but it is completely blue. So from Team Blue. We can see that this card has a blue cover. The PCB, you can see here, is blue. Very interesting. The power connectors, they're blue. Apparently Sparkle is like a brand that has been resurrected because of this Arc, and I'm quite liking this design. Like, it's not that blingy blangy. And this Sparkle here does light up, and the interesting thing about this is temperature controlled. So when your GPU gets hotter, the LED of this slightly goes like warmer until it's red. That means it's very hot. And when it cools down, it goes down to like red, amber, yellow, blue, and then white. I love when this card looks white. It just looks amazing inside. So where does this card slot into then? The Intel Arc A750 is kind of in the 3060, 4060 and 3050 competitor, because this one right here, because we need to talk about the pricing first. This Arc A750 you can pick up between $209. Right now I'm seeing on Amazon the Founders Edition of A750 is $210. Maybe you can get it for around $200 for A750. This card is a little bit of a, OC version, better cooler and so on. So this comes between $250, $220, something like that, depending on a deal. I highly recommend checking out the latest deals in the description below. I'll leave some of the other cards there as well, the A750s, so you can pick which one you like the most and then basically which is the best price to save the most money. But the 3050 is around $250, so around 9% more expensive than the A750. Then the RTX 3060 is roughly around $290, something like that. There's cards that are more expensive and cards that are less, but somewhere in there right now, not the MSRP, but what you can pick them up right now, which is about 26% more expensive. And then the RTX 4060 is around 35% more expensive, around $310, something like that, dollars. Some of them more expensive, some of them you can get less as well, where some around 300, 310, which is 30 to 35% more expensive. So said that, now this card is the cheapest of the bunch, right? And if it performs accordingly, about 10% slower than the rest of the cards, it kind of just matches into the park. If it performs better than 10% slower, then we know this is a good card. You gotta wait for the results though. So let's talk about the specs Firstly, we've got RTX 4060, 3060, and Arc A770 and RTX 3050 there. Now, even though the Arc kind of architecture of the GPU, we can't compare them because it's not apples to apples. The TMUs or the tensor cores on the NVIDIA cards aren't the same as in here. Intel's got their own Xe architecture and rendering slices and things going on. But if you're looking at the specs on Tech PowerUp, then some of these specs can be compared there. So first of all, the A770 is called, the GPU inside there is called DG2-512. Interestingly, this is not actual Intel's own node of the silicon. They're actually using the 6nm TSMCs to produce these GPUs. So interestingly, they're not selling their own silicon with the GPUs. I think this might change, but we'll see. Now the CUDAs, TMUs, tensor cores and RT cores kind of can't be compared to each other because they're a little bit different. So if you look at Intel Archive specs for the Arc A750, then you can see they're called different. So just so you know. But if you're looking at there, interestingly, the CUDA cores are same as RTX 3060. Well, these aren't called CUDA cores in here, but if you look at Tech PowerUp specs, then that's what's going on there. The memory type is GDDR6. And we've got 8 GB of it. But Intel did something right and didn't cap the memory bus on this card. This has got 256-bit memory bus, which means that the memory bandwidth is 512 GB per second compared to the 272 which we have on the RTX 4060, which is almost half of the bandwidth of this. The bus bit is half of it because 128, 256. It's PCIe Gen 4 X16 slot, and the TDP of the Arc A750 is 225 watts, but this card in stock pulls around 180 watts. Now, you can actually adjust it in the Intel Arc control center and just shift it to 216 watts on this one. But I was testing most of the benchmarks with just how it comes at stock, but I did do one test in the end, which you'll see when it was, overclocked or whatever you want to call it, when the power limit is boosted over what it comes at stock, even though it's still on the basically manufacturer's stock setting, because the Arc A750 can go up to 225 watts, if that makes sense. The 3060 and 4060, both of them actually use less wattage. The 4060 only 115 watts, maybe sometimes more with some of the cards, but they're actually more power efficient than the A770. If you want to check out my GPU test bench setup, then I'm going to leave that in the description below. First of all, Geekbench. And here I've got to make a massive note that the Geekbench has changed. It's not Geekbench 5 anymore, now it's Geekbench 6. Even though I had Geekbench 5 installed, it didn't launch it with this card, so I wasn't able to get a Geekbench 5 of this. I do have Geekbench 6 of OpenCL and Vulkan that you can see. The rest of the cards, the NVIDIA cards, are Geekbench 5, so they can't be really compared to each other, but just to kind of put it in some kind of perspective, and if you want to compare yourselves at home, you can do that with these. But because I don't have the 3060 and 4060 in right now, I can't give you these specs. But now the creator benchmarks. First of all, Photoshop. And as you can see, the Arc A750 is performing, wait a second, yeah, right on the top of the bunch here. All of the more expensive cards are slower. The 4060, which this card actually shouldn't compare with because 4060 came after this card, is actually about 10% slower. The 3060 is about 5% slower, and interestingly, the 3050 performs roughly about on par with this, with exactly the same test bench setup, which actually shows that a good GPU in Photoshop doesn't actually give you a ton of performance. So kind of any of these will be fine, even though we see these performance differences there. Moving on to Lightroom Classic, there's really no difference in there. This card is very, very good for you. And in fact, you might want to pick up this one because it's got very good display support. So it's got 4 video outputs, 3 of them display ports, and then 1 of them HDMI port, and they're all HDMI 2.0 and DisplayPort 2.0 that support up to 8K resolution. Nothing special, but if you want an affordable card that performs very, very well, then this is good. Also, at that point, might as well go with the A380 because it's even more affordable. But now the big news, which is video editing performance. And this is why I have been waiting to actually make a review of this one, because I can't call it a creator card if you can't really utilize the biggest video editing software or by users in the world, which is some of the Adobe programs like Premiere Pro. Now, Premiere Pro has a beta version of Premiere Pro 24 where hardware acceleration is enabled on the Arc GPUs, which means that those media engines inside this Arc GPU, which it actually has got two, it's got two multi-codec, engines inside like you have on the UHD 770. So kind of very similar media engines what you have on the iGPU, but now you have them also on the DGPU, but on the DGPU, theoretically, they're actually slightly better because of higher clock speed and blah, 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 blah. But if you've got an iGPU and then this card, like an Intel 13700K with this card, then in theory you actually have 2+2 media engines. And the interesting thing is Intel actually advertised when they launched the Arc that they have a special technology that has, encoding with the iGPU plus the DGPU media engines work together, and then, they kind of lower down the exporting speed, for example, or encoding speed. The interesting thing is right now, I don't see that working perfectly because I don't think all of the programs utilize this, or the software support actually for this hardware isn't fully still working, because NVIDIA has got the dual encoders in some of their 4080s and 4090s, which means that they can splice the frame in half and then encode top half and bottom half and then put it back together. Now, in theory, what this hardware can do with an iGPU and DGPU, that they can actually split the frame in four. Let's say a dedicated GPU renders the upper part and then iGPU bottom part with the two media engines, and then it gets all put together. But that part will still have to wait for that support. But basically, on Premiere Pro 24 beta version, if you want to get it, you can get it right now. The hardware decoding and encoding on this is supported, so those media engines finally work. The interesting thing is, I have actually benchmarked this card with the previous version, the 23.6, and you're saying, why on earth would you do that? Well, because the benchmark actually doesn't work with beta versions. But you'll see with the results, it's absolutely amazing still, knowing that when the 24 comes out, the performance is going to be even better. So, the Arc A750 in Premiere Pro, you can see that the 3060 is 5 to 3% slower. Actually 5.5 to 3.7% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. The RTX 4060, which is a much newer card, is about 3.3% and 7.8% slower. And the RTX 3050 is 16.7 and 15.9% slower. Then you can see this card is very, very impressive with the price point. Now, this card doesn't compete with the likes of 4070, 4080, 4090, or even 3080 or 3090. It's on a lower end, and the price suggests that. But looking at the performance in there, it's impressive, especially if you're looking at GPU effects, where both of the NVIDIA cards, the 3060 and 4060, are kind of performing on par, slightly slower, but the 3050 that's still more expensive is about 30% slower, which means that once the Premiere Pro 24 comes out, it does make the performance even better. As you can see, some of the scores are still slower than the NVIDIA cards, like the intra-frame on standard extended scores there, as well as GPU effects on the extended score. Moving on to After Effects, unfortunately, I didn't manage to get the benchmark working, and I don't think this is Intel's fault, because After Effects benchmark has always got... This is the problematic benchmark version, but that doesn't mean that this card doesn't work in there. I'd expect similar performance differences what you see in Premiere Pro on the After Effects side of things. But if you want really good After Effects performance, this card probably isn't the best one out of it either. So getting After Effects, you'll get at least similar performance, not better performance than the 3060, 4060 and 3050. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, the news keep being very, very good. The 3060 is about 3 to 4% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. GPU effects, bear in mind, are about 12% slower. The RTX 4060 is about 3% slower. and roughly on par on the standard overall score. Interestingly, the 4K media score is better, but the 3050 is about 67% slower and GPU effects 34% slower. So in DaVinci Resolve, it's very, very good, as you can see. Now, the 3D performance is somewhat where the news don't get as good, because Intel Arc isn't supported in some of the main rendering applications that are out there. What I mean by that is V-Ray doesn't really work. Octane Render doesn't work either. Blender, it does work, which we'll look at the benchmarks in a moment. And then Redshift, but basically if you're looking for the 3D performance of the card, it's probably still worth going with NVIDIA at this point and not even AMD rather than this one here. But looking at the Blender performance there, we can see that the A750 is actually slowest in the bunch comparing it to the 3060 or 4060. 3050 obviously is about 18 to 23% slower than this A750, which is still cheaper than the 3050, which actually makes this card still kind of awesome in Blender, but the 3060 and 4060 are considerably faster there. Like the 3060 is about 21 to 24% faster, and with the bigger VRAM capacity at 12 gigabytes, it might make more sense in Blender to go with the 3060, and the 4060 is absolutely insane, about 60 to 80% faster, but I'd kind of rule the 4060 out just because when you actually start working with some of the textures and loading the VRAM up, you're going to be capped by the memory bus, and it starts working worse than the 3060 because of NVIDIA's 3060 and 3060 Ti memory bus bandwidth kind of bottlenecks. It's not recommended, whereas this one isn't that. But do you remember I mentioned that this card can be overclocked, or just slipping a slider in there and then clicking that these settings can be applied straight away when launching Windows? You can move the wattage or TDP from 180 watts to 216 watts. So I was curious, how much difference are we going to actually see when moving that? So looking at the performance, we're getting roughly about 6.5% in the monster scene. The junk shop scene is about 1% slower, so basically no change in there. And in classroom scene, we're gaining about 6.5%. So if you're happy with the extra performance or like the heat in there, then there is a little bit of performance on the table. Now, if you're wondering if this is heating the card up in any way, then absolutely not. On this card, the cooling temperatures are very, very good. As you can see in some of the torture tests, it doesn't go above 70 degrees, like at all. It's very, very safe temperatures. It's just happily sitting there in a very happy environment, and that's pulling around 180 watts. If you push it a bit more, yeah, maybe you get 75, 80 degrees, but my ambient is 26.4 or something like that. If you've got it cooler, the card's going to perform obviously much cooler as well. So even sliding the slider to go a little bit more than 180 watts, temperature-wise, this card doesn't have any issues. So why is this Arc release now such a big deal? It's because when you're looking at the hardware encoding performance, this is now supported on Adobe Premiere Pro. But if you were running the likes of Intel Threadripper system or something like that, even if you had an RTX 4090 in there, the 4090 doesn't support a certain codecs like H.265 10-bit 422, which now can hardware decode it on this GPU and encode it as well, which is much faster than using the software encoding or decoding on the Threadripper Pro setups. Have a look at Puget Systems' article on this because they went very, very in depth with some of the encoding and decoding performance with the Intel Arc. I highly recommend checking that out if you want a little bit more reading to do. But in general, the Arc performs better than the 4060 and 3050 at the same price point, and add something to your Threadripper system, a card that can be only a few $100s, which is quite insane. So do I recommend this product? Absolutely. So first of all, you're not just saving money. And if you do, feel free to pick up some merch. You're also getting more performance at a lower price point, which just makes this card absolutely amazing. I mean, it's really hard to find bad things to say about this card right now. I know there's still some performance quirks at some point because this is the newest architecture of GPUs on the market next to AMD and NVIDIA, But Intel, in terms of content creation workflow, has absolutely slid past AMD. No problem there, because AMD cards, they don't work as well in Premiere Pro. Even though Premiere Pro decoding, just so you know, the priority is NVIDIA, AMD, and then Intel. So if you've got an AMD iGPU and Intel DGPU in there, it's gonna start to use AMD iGPU cards like a 7800X or 7950X. It uses the iGPU before it starts to use the DGPU media engines in there in terms of hardware decoding and encoding. So even though Adobe kind of supports AMD before Intel, the Intel cards are still actually better if you don't have an iGPU, and even if you do, I'd kind of disable it just to get the media engine support in there, which is much better. Now feel free to check out the A750 in the description below. I'll leave a few options for you in there. But the last thing I do want to talk about this is, which is absolutely genius from Intel. A lot of people might be saying, yeah, but this is not a competition to 4090, 4080, 4070 even, and you're absolutely right. And Intel has been absolutely genius about this. Now imagine if they did launch something that is theoretically on bar or a little bit slower or worse of a performance than 4090 or 4080, but because it's a new architecture, or the driver support and software support is very, very poor, what will happen is not a lot of people will adapt to this, because they're thinking at that price point, it's not worth spending money on Intel card where I can get absolutely solid performance from a 4080, 4090 or 3080, 3090, right? What Intel did was gave a very, very affordable option to everybody and said, look, we're a little bit slower than the 3060, 3040. They said 3060 at that point because 4060 wasn't out there. And we're a little bit slower, so we it's better bang for buck basically with our card, which meant that a lot of people adapted this. They've probably sold millions of these cards, and now gathering millions of people doing testing and working on this. And because of the millions of users, all the software developers have to work with Intel to create the actual support for their software. Adobe, Blender, all of these other programs which push the software developers to actually adopt the Arc much better. And now for the whole year, when you look at the first driver to the last driver, there is an insane difference in terms of performance, because previously it kind of wasn't competitive with NVIDIA. Now it's better than NVIDIA and nothing has changed. It's the same card. So to release something in the more budget range to get this Intel Arc quickly adopted into the market, into the software, what a genius move. As a business owner myself, I'm thinking this is a very, very clever business move, and I can't wait to see what is the next generation of Arc like. So if you're interested in building or create a PC and getting the best bang for buck, check out the build guides in the description below. Now knowing this video data on this video, you might want to change the GPU in some of the lower end budgets, because this performs better than some of the NVIDIA cards. Now it's time for me to start benchmarking the Arc A750. I'll see you soon.